Welcome. I'm Dr. Owen Anderson, and I've been working on a series about critical theory. So today we're going to look at an article about decolonizing. And this is a very good representative article by Aníbal Quijano titled Coloniality and Modernity / Rationality that appeared in Cultural Studies in 2010. And Quijano does a great job of laying out the philosophy of history that he has, and how there are two presuppositions at work in history, and they're in conflict with each other. So we want to see how well does he get to the way that conflict works out. I'm going to highlight this as we go. Well, essentially, we'll read this together. So he begins with, and incidentally, he's a Peruvian sociologist. He says, with the conquest of the societies and cultures which inhabit what today is called Latin America, began the constitution of a new world order, culminating 500 years later in a global power covering the planet. This process implied a violent concentration of the world's resources under the benefit or under the control and for the benefit of a small European minority, and above all, its ruling class. So I like this. Here, what we get is the idea that you can break history up into chunks. And 500 years is usually a pretty good chunk of history. And what's going on is that in this piece of history, there's something new happening in the conflict between these two presuppositions. And he's saying that in his last 500 years, one of them spread itself over the whole world and created a new world order. And it used violence to do this in order to control the world's resources for a few. So let's continue. Right now, we'll just kind of go through this and see what he says, and then we'll assess it and ask some questions about it. Although occasionally moderated when faced with the revolt of the dominated, this process has continued ever since. So the idea is there are oppressed and oppressors. And the oppressors, so it should be oppressors and oppressed, because the oppressors are up here, they're that small minority, and they're Western Europe dominators who have oppressed the Americas, Africa, Asia. And they used, he says, that the specific colonial structure of power produced the specific social discriminations which later were codified as racial, ethnic, anthropological, or natural. So they used these categories. They invented these categories in order to control and discriminate between people. Another one that sometimes gets added in there is religion. They invented religion also, the world's religions. In order to say, we're this religion, you're that religion, and we have to control you in what you do. So let's continue down. In fact, if we observe the main lines of exploitation and social domination on a global scale, the main lines of world power today and the distribution of resources and work among the world population, it's very clear that the large majority of the exploited, the dominated, the discriminated against are precisely the members of the races, ethnies, or nations into which the colonized populations were categorized in the formative process of that world power from the conquest of America and onward. So you'll see that the flow of oppression and the flow of benefits. Now, there is some movement in this. Some people from the Americas or other continents might do well in this new order. And you could even raise a question if they're doing better than they were in the previous order of things. Say in Peru, that would have been under the Incas. How well were people doing under the Incas, and how much upward mobility is it possible now versus then? So making these assessments necessarily then gets you involved in making comparisons. We say, well, it's really bad now, as opposed to when? Well, it was really bad in the past also. Okay, it's really bad now compared to an ideal of what it should be like. And that's part of what we're going to see is the assessment of good and evil. By what standard are we assessing the things are bad now, or good now, or just now, or unjust now? They were better in the past or worse in the past. Well, we have to know what is good in order to do that. And that's really, once we've got the pieces of history in place, that's really what we need to know before we can make determinations. Well, what is good and what isn't good? Now, he might be appealing just to a direct intuition, which says if the majority of resources are in the hands of a few, that seems unjust. That's right. And of course, that was true under the Incas also, or that was true in Rome also. So that's realization there's something called natural evil. There's suffering, strife, struggle in the world. And part of what we're wondering then is this bigger question of where does it come from? Has it always been there? Can humans, through their own efforts, undo that? Is it a feature of the world inherently? Say, as long as there's been humans, there's always been this kind of struggle between humans? Or is it something that was introduced to the world after the beginning? Suffering and strife between people. So what will free us from that? How will we overcome natural evil? That's a great question. Let's keep going. So he says, in the beginning, colonialism was a product of systematic repression, not only of the specific beliefs, ideas, images, symbols, or knowledge that were not useful to the global colonial domination, while at the same time, the colonizers were expropriating from the colonized their knowledge, specifically in mining, agricultural engineering, as well as their products and work. The repression fell, above all, over modes of knowing, of producing knowledge, of producing perspectives, images, and systems of images, symbols, modes of signification over the resources, patterns, and instruments of formalized and objectivized expression, intellectual or visual. So this is where his article is really good, because he gets back to epistemology. Now, the idea of systematic repression, in his analysis, this begins as the kind of Marxist material dialectic. And we've seen that already. He's talking about economic goods being accumulated in the hands of a few and the majority don't have them, and you have the material dialectic, the conflict between those in history. But then he's going to get into what sounds a little more like a Freudian dialectic, repression and the need to be freed from repression, to free yourself so you can authentically express yourself and integrate yourself into your world. And the way that repression happens is by the colonization of knowledge. Now, here's a problem with the word knowledge. When you have knowledge, what you claim to know is true. And insofar as you know it, you can show it's true. So you couldn't colonize knowledge and take it away. That's more like an opinion, a false opinion. If you know something and the other person comes to know it also, now you both know it. Knowledge increases like that. It's communal. As you share it, it grows more and more. So here he'll use the word knowing sometimes in a way that seems to mean what people thought was true, but it might turn out that it wasn't true. But at other times he uses it more like instrumental knowing, a knowing how to. And he named those there. I read mining, agriculture, engineering, how to do those things in, say, the New World, that kind of knowledge. But other times he's talking about something more like religion. Religious knowledge, say, of the deities or the spirits in nature. But that's only knowledge if indeed there are spirits in nature and you can show there are spiritual nature. Otherwise, if there are spirits in nature and you believe there are spirits in nature, but you can't show it, what you have is a true opinion, a true belief. If you have knowledge, then there are spirits in nature and you can show there are spirits in nature. So that's the conflict we're going to see that he starts to bring out, which is claims of knowledge, claims about what the world is like, claims about the cosmos, cosmology, are in conflict with each other. So he says this colonization was followed by the imposition of the use of the ruler's own patterns of expression and their own beliefs and images with reference to the supernatural. So you had one religion replacing another religion. The question is going to be, though, were those religions on different sides of these two presuppositions you're going to identify, or were they expressions of was it a civil war? There are two views of the supernatural, which are essentially on one side of this conflict. And I think that's what we're going to find out. What he's identifying is that in the last 500 years, both, we'll call them cities. We'll say the two cities, referencing Augustine. And what Quijano is recognizing and helpful for us is that the cities as a way of life, city represents culture, the fullness of human life together, have underlying philosophical assumptions about the world. And those underlying philosophical assumptions are in dialectic. There's A and there's non-A. And they can't both be true, they can't both be false, and they're both in competition to spread over the whole world. However, within them, there could be civil wars, civil conflicts. So what he may be identifying is one of those two spreading in the world, using violence to spread itself, and absorbing others which share that presupposition, but imposing their own patterns of expression of the same cosmology, the same reference to the supernatural. I think that's what we'll find out. So he says the colonizers imposed a mystified image of their own patterns of producing knowledge and meaning. So they impose this. Now, this also raises a question for us we should consider. Can beliefs be imposed on you? Now, outward forms can be imposed on you. You could be forced on pain of prison or even death to do something, but they can't force you to believe it's true. So they can force outward conformity, but they can't actually impose a belief on you unless you accept it yourself as true. So this gets into some problems. They might have imposed a structure that assumed their knowledge, but in that structure, people were going along with it, but not really believing it. So the European culture set was made seductive because it gave access to power. And this was the cultural Europeanization that transformed the whole world. And you had to agree to that to have access to power. And why do you want power? Well, to have access to the benefits of this life. Again, back to overcoming natural evil. You want power so you can overcome suffering in this life. Well, why is there natural evil at all? What's its origin? What's its purpose? So he says the forms and the effects of that cultural coloniality have been different as regards to times and cases. And he gives some examples here, which we can go through, of the specific differences in the Americas, Africa, Asia. Coloniality, then, is still the most general form of domination in the world today. Once colonialism as an explicit political order was destroyed, it doesn't exhaust, obviously, the conditions nor the modes of exploitation and domination between people. So in one sense, colonies aren't expanding, and partly that's because they had filled the whole earth, but also because there was a collapse of the colonies after World War II. But their effects remain. So it hasn't ceased to be for 500 years their main framework. This colonial relationship still dominates the world. So let's get down and see, well, what are these? I've hinted already that he says that there are philosophical assumptions underlying this. Let's get to what they are. So coloniality of power was conceived together with America and Western Europe, and with the category of race as the key element of social classification of colonizers, of colonized and colonizers. So race for him is the primary idea, which makes him different in one sense, and critical race theory as different than, say, critical theory or Marxist theory, where those might make economics the main focal point, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the capitalists and the workers. Here it makes race the primary idea, because they would say those other economic categories are based on race and race divisions. And so the Europeans divided up the world into different races in order to exploit them. So the process of Eurocentrification of the New World power, remember that New World Order, in the following centuries gave way to the imposition of such a racial criteria to the new social classification of the world population on a global scale. So in the first place, new social identities were produced all over the world, whites, Indians, etc. And those were used to exploit people by those few who then took the benefits away from them. So coloniality of power is based upon racial social classification of the world population under Eurocentered world power. Okay. Now, still the question is, under which of the two presuppositions does this fall? All right, let's keep going here. Now, during the same period as European colonial domination was consolidating itself, the cultural complex known as European modernity and rationality was being constituted. The intersubjective universe produced by the entire Euro-centered capitalist colonial power was elaborated and formalized by the Europeans and established in the world as an exclusively European product and as a universal paradigm of knowledge and of the relation between humanity and the rest of the world. So when he says rationality here, what he's talking about is the capitalist colonial power and the order of the world into that. So rationality means a mode of thinking and how we think about the world. So we began to think about the world in terms of capitalism, markets, products, buying and selling. So that's what he says here is simply the Marxist assessment. This is how Marx assessed the world also. Taking the last 500 years and assessing it largely in terms of capitalism. Now, what he's doing is he's going to critique this and say, really underneath that capitalism is an epistemology. And that epistemology is mistaken. So let's keep going. So he says he's going to say that examining some of the basic questions of that crisis will help to illuminate the problem. The crisis of this cultural complex. So that's what you want to do in decolonizing. What you want to do is you want to expose the philosophical presuppositions that have been taken for granted and test them for meaning. So, okay, we can do that. Let's try that. So the question of the production of knowledge. Now notice some of that wording there, kind of Marxist wording, the production of goods. Knowledge becomes a good that's produced. So if we're going to do a critique of this, we'd have to go back and see its connections to Marxist assumptions, and we may not want to accept these assumptions. So then that would mean the whole assessment he's giving us is incorrect. However, I think what he's going to do, even setting that aside, even agreeing, yeah, he's using this framework. He's in one way begging the question. He's assuming to be true what he needs to prove to be true. Even given that, what I think he's going to do that was just helpful is he's still going to show there are fundamental presuppositions, his word, that we need to expose and question. So let's look at these. Here's the first one. The presupposition, the subject is a category referring to the isolated individual because it constitutes itself in itself and for itself, in its discourse and its capacity of reflection. So he's going to say Descartes, Cartesianism, is the modern philosophy, and Descartes gave us this idea of this isolated individual. So second, that's the first, the subject. Then second, the object is a category referring to an entity not only different from the subject, individual, but external to it, to the latter by its nature. So you have subject, thanks to Descartes, and object. And third, this object is also identical to itself because it is constituted by properties, which give it its identity and define it. So you have things that are discrete, self, other. And he's going to say that's the underlying presupposition that leads to capitalism and exploitation. Now you'd wonder, I guess you would do a different assessment. You say, well, what led to the Incan exploitation of others? Was that couldn't have been Cartesianism? Was it something like that? So I think there may be some problems on the one hand in his view of Descartes. This is not what Descartes was talking about. But that could be set aside because we're not here to find out who's the real Descartes or what is European philosophy exactly. But just to see that at the basic level, his concern is that view. Now he's going to articulate his view. Let's see what that is. So here's where this comes into problems. First, the individual and the individualized nature of the subject, which is a half-truth and falsifies the problem because it denies intersubjectivity and the social totality of the production sites of all knowledge. So the problem is the individual versus holism, intersubjectivity. All things are connected. All is one. And now we're getting closer to identifying the two basic assumptions. One of them is all is one. All is connected. So second, the idea of object is incompatible with the results of the current scientific research, according to which the properties are modes and times of a given field of relations. So interestingly, he appeals to current science, right? Now, if you're doing that, you're recognizing there was a past science, which now we think is wrong, and therefore there will be a future science which thinks the current science is wrong. But he's appealing to the idea that there are only fields and relationships. All is one, interconnected. There aren't discrete things. Third, the externality of the relations between the subject and the object, founded on differences in nature, is not only an arbitrary exaggeration of the differences, since current research rather leads to the discovery that there exists a deeper communication structure of the universe. So he's appealing to science, and the scientists who are making this claim maybe are just begging the question. They came to it with this assumption and then found that assumption in their observations. But the idea that there's a deeper communication structure in the universe, this is leading us to all is one. Now, at this point, I don't think he's clearly identified the distinctions. We'll get to them in a minute. But the idea of a deeper communication structure in the universe, keep that in mind. I'm going to come back to that. In Greek philosophy, that was called the logos. That which makes sense of, is an account of, is the reason for the universe. But he's going to end up putting that on the other side as one of the European philosophies. So he says, one can, of course, recognize the idea of subject as an isolated individual, an element and an instance of the process of liberation of the individual with respect to the adescriptive social structures that imprisoned it in Europe. The latter condemn the individual to one single place and social role during its entire life, as happens in all societies with rigidly fixed hierarchies. So again, that would be the Incas. They had rigidly fixed hierarchies. So then you could get into a question, does the modern world offer more mobility between classes than any other group ever in the history of the world? Whether that's Rome, Greece, Middle East, wherever it is, possibly. So then you say, well, yeah, we're critiquing it for not having done better what it was trying to do, which would be a critique the modern world accepts. It says, you're right. We were working on that. We haven't yet achieved that. We need to keep going. But that's very different than saying we need to scrap the whole project because it's based on false presuppositions and it's given us the wrong world order. So he says, probably it is not accidental that knowledge was considered then in the same way a property, a relation between an individual thing and something else. So here it's interesting. He's calling into question the reality of the self as distinct and knowledge as something the self has, and instead saying it's a property of the group in an intersubjective manner, but then also that the group or that the individual has some rights. So if the group begins to oppress the individual, and really the small minority in the group, the haves, oppress the have-nots should be able to say, no, we have knowledge and you don't. But you really get into a problem then of whose intersubjectivity counts as knowledge. Why not the few? Is it just a matter of numbers? So he still would have the problem of answering what property makes something knowledge versus merely an opinion. And here's what he's doing. He's giving us an argument. He's saying, follow my line of thinking and you'll come to a conclusion that's sound. So he's calling rationality within capitalism one thing, but he's still appealing to a higher sense of rationality in order to say he's giving us an argument that is sound and we should listen to it. So there is, in other words, someone could say, well, that's just your rationality. I'm not going to listen to you any more than you're not going to listen to me. Or I could say, you're right. There is something called reason. And reason gives us arguments. And you're giving us an argument, and we should follow your argument and see if the premises lead to the conclusion. And if they do, we should believe it. But if they don't, then you shouldn't believe it. You should abandon it. So he's going to say that the association between individual and dualism and the European social and cultural conflicts at the time when the main European paradigm of rationality was elaborated, that's the problem. Individualism or dualism. Let's call it ethical egoism and dualism. There's me and there's the world, and I live in the world to make myself happy, and we all live that way. That's called capitalism, and that works out for the best society for the most number of people. Now, if you were just doing like a numerical case of, that might end up being proven to be true. If you could somehow like go in time and quiz populations and see, has capitalism produced more content people than past regimes? What if it turns out that it did? The assumption here is that it didn't. because there still exists people who are oppressed. But if you're purely doing it on that basis, and I'm not advocating for that, but if you're doing it just on that basis, you might find out that although there are oppressed people now, there's fewer percentage-wise, not numerically because there's more people, but there's fewer percentage-wise than there were under past regimes, like say Rome. So then you say, well, did this really lead to a problematic, or is the problem that they didn't apply it as consistently as they should have? I think there's a different problem, which I'm going to bring out. So this self and individualism, dualism is the problem, and he's going to say that should be contrasted with his holism. I'm going to suggest those are both versions of one of the two options. That's a civil war, which often happens in that city as they go to war in order to have peace. They go to war to take stuff to overcome suffering for themselves. So this is what happened, the relationship between European and other cultures viewed as objects, and the subject could go take things and not have to worry about them as other humans. And again, that might just be an oversimplification. I'm also not pointing out that within Europe, well, I'm about to, within Europe, it's greatly mixed. You do have some who have this perspective of others, that they're less than human, you can take from them. But you also have some who say, no, that's not true. De las Casas arguing and saying, no, you cannot treat people this way. So it's an oversimplified version of Descartes and then all of Europe as well. So he says this, in spite of his absence in the Cartesian paradigm, the intellectual necessity of the identity of totality, especially in relation to social reality, was present in the European debate early on in the Iberian countries, Spain, and then he mentions France. And that'd be interesting to look at the difference between Spanish and French colonies and Portuguese, put those in there because those are all Roman Catholic, and then say English or Dutch colonies. Were they different? And in what way were they different underneath, say, Protestantism and Roman Catholicism? European Western rationality and modernity is constituted not only in a disputatious dialogue with the church and its religion but also in the very process of restructuration of power. And so again, that's why I said within Europe, there was this inner conflict, because I think the dissenters in Europe, religious dissenters, would agree, sometimes called Protestants. They would agree and say, yeah, this religion was being used and enforced with violence, like even against us. And that's not how you can promote religion. And what he says, it produces a kind of reductionist vision of reality. So in fact, that perspective was certainly useful to introduce and to fix the idea of social totality, i.e. society, but it was also instrumental in making the same with two other ideas. One, society as a structure of functional relations among each and every one of the parts, and therefore linked to the action of the one sole logic, and therefore a closed totality. It led later to a systematic idea of totality and structural functionalism. The other idea was society as an organic structure where the parts are related according to the same rules of hierarchy between the organs as the image we have of every organism, and in particular, the human one, where there exists a ruling part, the brain, though it cannot expunge them in order to exist. The rest, in particular the extremities, cannot exist without being subordinated and related to the ruling part of the organism. So analogies being used to justify hierarchies and an internal logic. That's the internal rationality of these systems. Here he does get into some of the structure of communism and the understanding of society in the communist regime. Now, on the other hand, these organicist ideas imply the presupposition of a historically homogeneous totality, in spite of the fact that the order articulated by colonialism was not homogeneous. Hence, the colonized part was not, at bottom, included in the totality. As is well known, in the Europe of Enlightenment, the categories of humanity and society did not extend to the non-Western peoples, or only in a formal way in the sense that such recognition had no practical effects. So we're bringing into question the Enlightenment. Now there are different parts of alignment. There's purely secular parts of alignment, and then there are religious parts of alignment. Which ones didn't view others as humans? You couldn't simply say none of them did. That wouldn't be true. Oversimplification. Now, in this way, finally, the ideas of totality, which elaborate an image of society as a closed structure articulated in a hierarchical order with functional relations between its parts, presupposed a unique historical logic to the historical totality and a rationality consisting in a subjection of every part of that unique total logic. So given these presuppositions about the world, a system forms, and there's an internal total logic to that. But he's pointing out that the presuppositions are mistaken, and so the internal logic is incorrect and harmful as it's imposed on others. We can agree and say, yeah, that's right. This leads to conceiving society as a macro-historical subject endowed with a historical rationality and a lawfulness that permits production of the behavior of the whole and of its parts, as well as of the direction and the finality of its development in time. So the idea that there's justification to oppress others because of your presuppositions that lead to this logic of what history is like. Now, he says the idea of totality in general is today questioned and denied in Europe, not only by the perennial empiricists, but also by an entire intellectual community that calls itself postmodernists. So the postmodernists lean more towards relativism. There's not a total logic. And he says, in fact, in Europe, the idea of totality is a product of colonial modernity, and it is demonstrable, as we have seen above, that the European ideas of totality led to theoretical reductionism and to the metaphysics of a macro-historical subject, which the postmodernists call into question in the name of more local relativism. The total rationalization of society, incidentally, is another idea out of the Marxist regimes. And it really means something more like the utilitarian ordering of society. Rational means organizing it to be most efficient for the capitalist or most fair for the communist, even though in practice it turned out to be not fair at all. So just to say that, just because he's using these words, right? Rationalization and rationality in one sense, but then he's using reason himself, and so are the postmodernists, to present us with arguments, which presumably they want to be sound arguments. So they can't get away from that sense of reason. It's not necessary, however, to reject the whole idea of totality in order to divest oneself of the ideas and images with which it was elaborated within European colonial modernity. What is to be done is something very different: to liberate the production of knowledge, reflection, and communication from the pitfalls of European modernity, rationality, or in other words, to liberate them from these false presuppositions. And that's almost a tautology, that we should want to be liberated from what's false. You wouldn't say that if you're believing something that's true, that you're oppressed. You say, no, I believe the truth. So what we need to do, the work that we need to do, is show that these presuppositions are false. So he says, outside the West, virtually in all known cultures, every cosmic vision, so you kind of, this might be oversimplification, but okay, besides the West, every cosmic vision, every image, all systematic production of knowledge is associated with the perspective of totality. We'll call that all is one. But in those cultures, the perspective of totality in knowledge includes the acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of all reality, of the irreducible, contradictory character of the latter, of the legitimacy, i.e., the desirability of the diverse character of the components of all reality, and therefore of the social. So this is one of the two presuppositions. All is one, and I'm not sure he's shown us that what he calls the modern philosophy is different than that. What he's going to, in other words, outside of the West, the modern West, every cosmic vision, which might include the pre-modern West, they all believed all is one. Ultimately, what they're doing is denying that there's God, the creator. That's the ultimate subject-object. God alone is the creator. All else is created. And he's going to say that. Let me see. That was back up here. on page 6. This when he's talking about the dualism he's rejecting, it includes divine reason and nature. So he starts off with the Cartesian self and other, but really it comes down to this dualism: God and the creation, the divine reason, also called the Logos in John chapter 1, and the world, which the Logos, all things were made by the Logos. That's what he's objecting to. But European philosophy in many points agrees with him then. Even someone like Plato or Aristotle, who you might call dualists, agree that all is one. The demiurge and the stuff of matter are co-eternal. The demiurge doesn't bring it from non-being into existence. Creation ex nihilo. That's not what happens. So he's especially objecting to, he's noticing the other side is the idea of God, the creator. He's rejecting that. And some parts of modernity did have that, but really most of the modern world that he would object to is actually on that other side. It's what I said earlier, it's more like a civil war. It agrees with his presupposition. There is no God. And instead, the world are objects that we have no moral accountability for and we can use as we please. So if he's going to object to that, then he would have to accept the other view, which is God, the creator. All right, so he thinks this critique of the modern, of the European paradigm of rationality is indispensable. I agree with him. It's set up a world order, a new world order, he called it. But I would disagree with him about which of the two presuppositions it is. I think it's within the framework of that all is one presupposition. And within that presupposition, there is no accountability or morality higher than the self or the group. That's the competition. Within all is one, you'll have these two branches form, individualism and collectivism, and they'll fight each other about which gives the best life. And that's a civil war between them, but they agree about the basic assumption. It's sort of like the Apostle Paul when he goes to Athens and he finds the Epicureans and the Stoics debating. They're in the same family, though, of assumptions. They're just debating about some of the ways those assumptions work out. So he says the alternative then is clear: the destruction of the coloniality of world power. How do you do that? Well, first of all, epistemological decolonization. Yes, let's do that. Let's expose that presupposition that there is no God and decolonize the world of that assumption. We don't want a world order set up on the rejection of the Logos. We want the world order that reflects that. And then he ends up with an appeal to reason when he says nothing is less rational, finally, than the pretension that the specific cosmic vision of a particular ethne should be taken as universal rationality. That's provincialism. You're taking Northwestern Europe and making its cosmic vision universal. That's irrational. Whether or not he can appeal to reason at this point without contradicting himself is another question. So he's working for the liberation of intercultural relations from the prison of coloniality and the freedom of people, of all people, to choose individually or collectively such relations, a freedom to choose between various cultural orientations, and above all, the freedom to produce, criticize, change, and exchange culture and society. The liberation is part of the process of social liberation from all power organized as inequality, discrimination, exploitation, and domination. Yeah, that sounds great, of course. Those are all terrible things. But the question is this: is it liberation from which presupposition? Liberation from all is one, there is no God the creator, or liberation from God and the divine reason, Logos? In his line of thought, he's wanting to be liberated from the divine Logos, to choose the alternative, to be your own God, determining good and evil. Is that what liberation is? Or is liberation the freedom to know God in all that by which he's made himself known? So I think he's right. He's identified a number of things that are true. A world order, which is based on presuppositions and has especially expanded the last 500 years. That there are two views at base. They're in conflict. And in the last 500 years, they've been both spreading. One of them has dominated more than the other. and that we want to decolonize that view by exposing its presuppositions and using reason to test them for meaning, so we can be free to believe what's true about the world and about what's eternal and about what's good for us as humans. So thanks for joining me as we're studying decolonization.